All right, let's jump right into this explainer of the source material. We're unpacking a pretty shocking sociological fracture happening right now between the US and Canada. The sources are actually calling this the Cainada betrayal. So we're going to explore exactly what happens when that deep neighborhood trust completely breaks down, and more importantly, the framework you can use to reclaim your own agency in the fallout.
We're plunging right into the data here with a really jarring vital sign. Look at this. Canadian favorability toward their American neighbors has suddenly plummeted to just 33%. 33%! I mean, think about that for a second. We aren't just talking about a casual cultural rivalry or a minor diplomatic spat anymore. No, this is a historic low.
Now, what's really fascinating about this plummet is the massive disconnect it creates. Because if you look at Gallup surveys, 80% of Americans still hold a very positive, favorable view of Canada. So Americans overwhelmingly like their northern neighbor, right? But that warmth is simply no longer mutual. We're looking at a completely, almost wildly lopsided relationship here.
And the source material makes it clear this isn't just about, standard trade friction. It is a deep, visceral sociological fracture. They explicitly frame this as a brotherly betrayal. It's this aggressive, elbows-up mentality that they compare to the biblical story of Cain and Abel, hence Cainada. It seems that aggressive political rhetoric has deeply alienated the Canadian public, basically replacing those old neighborly bonds with heavy physical alienation.
So to really understand this animosity, we got to look at the complete collapse of institutional trust, which happened over just a couple of years. Back in 2022, 83% of Canadians saw the US as a highly reliable ally. Today, that number is down to just 35%. And even more startling, nearly 70% now believe they should treat the US as a potential threat. It's a glaring symptom of a much wider hollowing out of the legacy state.
But the root cause of this resentment isn't solely cross-border, it's actually internal. America is described in these texts not as a single unified nation anymore, but as a binational state. Basically, two deeply opposed factions trapped in the exact same physical space. And everyday citizens? Well, they're caught in the middle. The sources call them moral crumple zones, basically forced to absorb the impacts and the failures of these centralized automated systems where they literally have zero agency.
So what do you do? How do you respond when top-down trust totally evaporates? Well, the sources introduce this really compelling framework of the sovereign pilot. Think of him as a modern-day Paul Revere on a digital midnight ride. But instead of a horse, they're riding their local hardware. They absolutely reject the passive guessing games of cloud AI. Instead, they choose to use manual, highly intentional effort to securely guarantee their own reality.
And a huge point here is that true digital sovereignty fundamentally requires the sweat of the brow. You just cannot outsource your intent to a centralized AI or some cloud server owned by a failing institution. If you want absolute, mathematically certain truth, you've got to put in the physical, manual effort yourself. It's basically a complete refusal to surrender your agency.
Okay, so how does this actually translate to collective action? The core ideological tool here is what the sources call the One Commandment. See, you don't need some massive, convoluted political manifesto to start a parallel society. You just need a single, explicitly stated moral code. It's a mandate designed to wake up the people around you, like fellow Canadians caught in this exact fracture, and align everyone under one shared purpose.
But how does a sovereign pilot literally execute this? Well, it's a very strict process. First, you formulate explicit human intent. Next, you wield the command line interface, the CLI, as a rigid, deterministic tool to translate that intent flawlessly into physical silicon. The texts refer to this final, irreversible manifestation as Hex 80, which basically locks in the unique thisness of an event. You are actively commanding the machine, building a perfectly recorded data trail that no centralized power can ever alter.
Which logically leads us to the ultimate exit strategy, right? If the legacy state is fracturing, and you have reclaimed your digital sovereignty, what comes next? The answer the sources give is establishing decentralized, opt-in parallel societies. You can think of these highly aligned functional local networks as fiefdoms. It's essentially a concrete way to escape that whole cycle of top-down resentment.
And they outline a highly actionable path to reach this sovereignty, which unfolds in 3 distinct phases. Step 1 is the network union, a 100% digital entity engaging in daily collective action. Step 2 is the network archipelago. That's where the digital union crowdfunds to acquire networked physical properties in the real world. And finally, step 3 is the network state, which happens when that physical archipelago actually gains diplomatic recognition from an existing legacy state.
Now, what makes these new sovereign networks so incredibly compelling is the radical shift in governance. Think about it. The legacy system relies on a coercive 51% democracy, right? Where a bare majority imposes its will on a deeply reluctant 49%. But in network union, that is a model for 100% opt-in democracy. It is entirely consensual. Every single person has explicitly chosen to be there based on that specific one commandment.
Which brings us to the ultimate choice. The blueprint for functional sovereignty is clearly written out here. But as the digital and physical worlds irrevocably collide, the choice really is up to you. Will you remain a passive subject, just absorbing the failures of centralized cloud compute? Or will you put in the sweat of the brow to become the sovereign pilot of your own digital substrate?